Good afternoon, and welcome to the webinar on producer services in Nebraska. This webinar is presented by the Bureau of Business Research, which is part of the College of Business here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. My name is Eric Thompson. I'm the director of the Bureau of Business Research, and we'll be leading you through a PowerPoint presentation today as part of the webinar, showing you, I think, are some interesting results on the growth and nature of the producer services industry here in Nebraska and around the country. As you'll see, it's an industry characterized by rapid job growth and high wages, and is therefore, I think, a useful focus as we think about the Nebraska economy. In addition to the PowerPoint, I'd like to point out several other features of the webinar today. In the lower right-hand part of your screen, you'll see that there's a chat room where you can chat back and forth. I guess it's a little bit like sending a text, except through our webinar, to some of the other participants in the webinar. And so you can look at the list of participants in the center right part of your screen and chat with either individuals or with the whole group. In addition to that, I'll point your attention to the question and answer window, which is in the center bottom part of your screen. The question and answer window is an opportunity for you to type in some questions that occur to you, either already occurred to you or occur to you during the course of the webinar. Just go ahead and type them in at the moment they occur to you. I'll be answering the questions at the end. Obviously, at the end of the PowerPoint presentation, you could also just ask the questions then if you'd prefer to do that. So we encourage people to answer questions, and we hope to wrap up the webinar by going through and answering your questions. Lastly, in the upper middle part of your screen, we have a poll question. In fact, we're going to have two poll questions where we're going to poll all of you participating in the webinar to get your opinion on subjects. And then we'll go ahead and, during the course of the webinar, compare what the opinions of the participants were with some actual data from the Nebraska economy and see where people are at. So you can see the first poll question there. Does Nebraska have a higher or lower share of employment in producer services? So once you feel comfortable giving your opinion on that, go ahead and do so. Obviously, it'd be nice to get a definition of producer services before you answer the poll question, and we'll be providing that to you shortly. So with all those points made, I'm going to go ahead and get started with our webinar. Just by way of brief outline, I'm going to provide you with some data to prove the point I made earlier, that producer services are high-wage industries with high employment growth. We're going to look at producer service industry trends here in Nebraska, and then also look within Nebraska to see which metropolitan areas seem to have the highest concentration of producer services employment. Let's get that definition of producer services. So it's really partly about who your customers are. So producer services are defined as firms who primarily provide services to other businesses, or you could say in general the business community, rather than providing services to households. So, to give an example from healthcare, a dentist primarily provides services to households and families, not to other businesses. But business service firms focus on business customers. So an example would be an accounting firm. Now, they could have some household customers, of course, but a lot of the accounting businesses provide a lot of services to business, have business clients as their primary clients and primary source of revenue. Similar with engineering or architectural firms, that's another key example of a producer services business, where a lot of those firms primarily are going to be providing services to construction firms or to real estate developers, to businesses building a new corporate headquarters, whatever that is. Their engineering and architecture firms primarily have customers in the business community or in government rather than households. Computer design services is another key example of producer services. Businesses are the primary customer. Sorry for that short interruption. Law firms are another excellent example of a producer services business. Consulting firms that provide advice on management, on product development and marketing, on human resource management. Those are all examples of producer services firms. I didn't have room to list every example, but the key point is these are businesses primarily involved in providing services and high-level services to other businesses. Now, as I've listed all these different industries that are part of the producer services sector, one thing you've probably noticed is these are very skilled types of work. Being an accountant is a very skilled types of work. Certainly being an engineer or an architect, someone who designs computer programs or computer networks. It's a very skilled type of work requiring a college degree, often a post-college degree as well, graduate degree. And so that's the other characteristic of the producer services sector tends to employ a lot of high-skilled labor, tends to have a lot of small and medium-sized businesses and partnerships owned by professionals, high-skilled professionals. So this is what the producer services is like. Now, it matches up pretty well with a particular industry code, Professional, Scientific, and Technical Services. That's the North American Industrial Code. That's what NAICS stands for. That corresponds with producer services, and it's Professional, Scientific, and Technical Services. So that again denotes the high-skilled labor that works in this industry. Okay, so I made the statement earlier that this is a rapidly growing industry in terms of adding jobs. Here's some evidence for that. We looked at the cumulative percent job growth from 2005 to 2014 in the producer services industry across the United States. That industry added 19% job growth during that 10-year period cumulatively. Almost 2% job growth per year. That's very rapid growth, particularly when you consider that across all industries during this period, job growth was only 4% cumulatively, only 0.4% per year. So while overall employment growth was stagnant, producer services were adding a lot of new jobs for college graduates, a lot of new jobs for people who had finished graduate degrees, which, as you might guess, is going to be high-wage employment. More on that in a minute. But the point is, while the overall employment was not rising, certainly the mix of employment was changing. Producer services were becoming increasingly important. You can see there around the U.S., there was a big decline in manufacturing jobs during that same period. Now let's look at those wages. And again, you see what a high-wage industry producer services is. Again, partly not surprising given the education requirements to work in the industry, but the average weekly wage of producer services workers across the United States was over $1,600 a week. Now, if you multiply that by a 50-week a year work schedule, that's more than $80,000 a year for an average wage. So indeed, this is a high-wage, high-growth industry. That's much higher than the all-industry average. Average weekly wages across all industries was just shy of $1,000. It's much higher even than manufacturing. Average weekly wages across all manufacturing industries in the U.S. stood at just above $1,200 in 2014. So about 25% less than the wages in producer services. Now this leads us now, I think we're getting to the point, we can start to think about that first poll question, and that is, does Nebraska have a higher or lower share of employment in producer services than the United States overall? So these high-wage, rapidly growing industries, does Nebraska have more of its employment in that sector, or less, or about the same as the United States? And we'll have some discussion about that in a little bit. But so far I've talked a lot about the growth and wages of producer services nationwide. Let's now focus specifically on Nebraska. So here you see growth in the producer services industry 2005 to 2014 just in Nebraska. And what you see is producer services employment also grew quite rapidly in Nebraska. So the cumulative growth over 10 years was 18%, nearly as rapid as nationally. So almost 2% a year of growth in this high wage employment here in our state. Once again, much better than the overall job growth rate. Nebraska was a little stronger than the U.S. during this period, so our employment grew 6% rather than 4% like the U.S., but still, producer service employment growth was much faster than overall employment growth. And like nationally, manufacturing jobs declined here in Nebraska as well. Luckily, we had rapid growth in producer service employment, which is high wage employment on average, to make up for some of those losses in manufacturing. Here's some evidence about higher wages in the producer services industry here in Nebraska. Now you'll notice that all these wages in Nebraska do tend to run a little lower than the wages nationwide. This is a well-known feature of the Nebraska economy, partly related perhaps to a lower cost of living in the state, but partly in actually a real lower wage. I'm not going to focus on that so much, but focus on the relative wages of the three sets of industries here in Nebraska. The relative wages it's a very similar pattern to what we saw in the U.S. Producer services by far had the highest average weekly wages, about $1,250 per week. If you multiply that by 50 weeks, that gets you around $62,000, $63,000 a year as the average wage in the producer services industry. So those are good jobs here in Nebraska. Much higher average wage than all industries, which is around $850, and a much higher average wage than the manufacturing industry. So again, not just creating a lot of job growth here in Nebraska, but growth of high-wage industries. Okay, so we're ready to answer the poll question. I see you were kind of split with about 55%, 56% saying Nebraska would have a higher share of employment in these producer services industries, and about 45% saying, or 44% saying Nebraska would have a lower share. Actually, it's the other way around. Nebraska has a lower share than the United States of employment in producer services industries. Now, why is that? You'll see it's partly related to sort of the rural nature of the state. I'll show you more in a minute. Now, why did the audience have not quite get it right? I think it's because we all know a lot of architects and people who are computer scientists or computer programmers. So you know a lot of people like this, but there's a lot of workers in the state, and so when you actually look at the share of people working in these industries, it ends up being a little smaller than you would expect. Okay, so why wouldn't it be surprising that Nebraska would have a somewhat lower share here? We'll get to that in a minute. Since we've answered the first poll question, we can go ahead and ask you the second poll question, which region of Nebraska has the largest concentration of producer services jobs? In other words, is it Omaha? Is it Lincoln? Is it other parts of the state where the overall concentration percentage was 4.23%? But what is it, or what is it in these different regions of the state? Which one has the highest share? So let's get to that in a minute. 4.42% is the statewide average percentage of employment in the producer services industry. Okay, now why is that? Why did we have a lower share than the U.S.? We'll get to the answer to the poll question here in a minute, but go ahead and register your vote if you're ready. The reason is, and I'll kind of sum this up before I give you the details, is producer services tend to concentrate in larger cities. There's, I guess, multiple reasons for that. So why does the share of employment in producer services vary from area to area, and why does it tend to be larger in larger urban areas? The first thing to remember is that producer services are exportable. So you often think of law firms, of accounting firms, of other producer services firms, of having a lot of customers locally, other businesses in the same city, and that's of course true. But it's also true that producer services firms, especially as they grow, can have a lot of customers outside of the area, in other parts of the same state, in other states, in other parts of the country. So in that sense, producer services are exportable. Not all your customers have to be local. You can export your services to customers located in other parts of the state, in other parts of the country. So it is possible then to have sort of more employment in this industry than you would expect, given how big your overall economy is, because you can attract and retain customers in other parts of the country. That said, it is advantageous to have a large local market. If you think about the formation of producer services firms, if you think about the growth of producer services firms, it's helpful for them to establish themselves in a good local market where there are a large number of local potential customers. So being in a somewhat larger city, a larger urban area, does give you an advantage in terms of getting established and reaching the size and scope that would allow you then to go compete for customers around the region and around the country. So if you put those two things together, the potential for exporting and the advantages in the industry of having a lot of local customers, it's the firms in producer services in the larger cities that have a bit of an advantage. They're able to use their local customer base to reach the size and scale, which then allows them to compete for customers in other cities in other parts of the country. Another big advantage that urban areas have in the producer services industry is with labor force. We know that the historical pattern, at least, has been that urban areas have been more attractive for college graduates and people with advanced degrees. Urban areas have had more luck attracting and retaining those types of workers. So that's the key workforce for the producer services industry, and therefore the firms located in urban areas have a bit of an advantage for that reason as well. So we wouldn't be surprised if producer services employment tend to be concentrated in metropolitan areas and especially in your largest metropolitan areas. We have some data on that point. So here we have 6 of the larger metropolitan areas in the U.S. This isn't obviously the 6 largest metropolitan areas, because you'd be expecting to see New York City, you'd expecting to see Chicago and others, but these are among the larger mega cities here in the United States. And you can see there is some variation. We did have Phoenix that was actually below the U.S. average in terms of the share of employment in producer services, but most of these larger cities have a higher share. Dallas at 6.8%. Comfortably above the national average of 6%. Los Angeles at 7%, comfortably above the national average. Atlanta all the way up at 8%, significantly higher than the national average. So Atlanta is something of a producer services hub for the southern region. Detroit up around 10%. So if you're wondering, gee, with all the auto jobs that have been lost, what do people do in Detroit these days? Well, almost 10% are in the metropolitan area are employed in the producer services sector, and it's not hard to imagine, some large engineering firms that might be located in the Detroit area, working on the automotive sector, working on other customer bases around the country. Finally, Washington, D.C. has the highest share, a lot of service to government agencies, no doubt, up around 15%. Okay, so we're ready then to give the answer to the poll question. Which region of Nebraska has the largest concentration of producer services jobs? Is it going to be Omaha, which is, from a national perspective, you would call a mid-sized metropolitan area? Or is it going to be Lincoln or Grand Island, which would be, even though there's a great difference in the size of those two metropolitan areas, I think both would be called smaller metropolitan areas. Grand Island is very much a smaller metropolitan area. Lincoln starting to get up towards a mid-sized, but still would, I think, fall in the smaller category. So you can see Omaha, if you recall that the statewide average was 4.4%, Omaha is all the way up at 5.5% of its employment in producer services businesses. That's above some of the cities you'd normally compare Omaha to, like Oklahoma City metropolitan area, the Des Moines metropolitan area, but it's also below some of the cities you'd compare Omaha to, like Kansas City or Colorado Springs or Salt Lake City. So Omaha is kind of middle of the pack, but it's well above the state average. Let's look at Lincoln and Omaha and compare it to a few other metropolitan areas. Lincoln is below Omaha, but above Grand Island. And Lincoln does a little better than some other metropolitan areas. The Lansing metropolitan area is somewhat similar to Lincoln, being a state capital and also having a major university. Lincoln has a larger share of its employment in producer services, larger than Fargo as well, but a little bit less than Lexington, Kentucky, which also has the state's major university and is quite near the capital. And then, of course, Madison, Wisconsin would be another example of a metropolitan area with both the state capital and a major university. Lincoln trails those a little bit. So our metropolitan areas in Nebraska are kind of middle of the pack for their peers, but we definitely see the pattern in Nebraska that the larger the metropolitan area, the larger share of employment to be found in producer services. And this matched up pretty well with what the participants in the webinar had thought. But the most common answer was that the Omaha area would have the largest concentration of producer services jobs. That turned out to be correct. Okay. Let me make some final points then. I think we've had a chance to talk about our main issues and points regarding this important producer services industry. Let me start by saying that Omaha and Lincoln were both above the state average. So that's where the industry is concentrated within Nebraska. Omaha and Lincoln MSAs are both sort of consistent with their peers or other similar situated metropolitan areas around the Midwest and near West. So we're doing all right in terms of capturing producer services. But, it's clearly an industry where the state of Nebraska would want to capture even more jobs. Again, it's an industry with great potential for job growth, and it's an industry that pays very high wages. And it's an industry, I didn't write this down, but kind of can help us with the brain drain problem because it provides services provides job opportunities to our college graduates. So this is potentially a very good industry for Nebraska to expand in further. Now, what can be done? I didn't write this either, but I think maybe a first step would be more of a focus on producer services in our economic development strategy. We quite appropriately focus on job growth in a number of industrial type sectors, but could there be more of a purposeful focus on the producer services industries as well? What can the state do to become an even more attractive location for engineering and consulting firms? Can we recruit firms like that at a faster pace into Nebraska? So that's one suggestion. A second suggestion was to make sure we have a highly trained workforce ready to work in this industry. I think the universities in the state do a good job with that. Lots of people graduating with degrees in accounting, engineering, computer science, and so forth. But can we do computer software programming and so forth? But can we do more, especially I think for computer and mathematical occupations? Can we increase the number of students focusing on these STEM fields? That could be a big positive for the growth in the producer services industry. A lot of producer service businesses, even the larger ones, tend to be proprietorships or partnerships among professionals. Could tax reform benefit this group of small business owners, high-wage, high-earning small business owners in particular? If we had a more pro-business tax code, would that benefit the growth of this industry especially? And lastly, and this is another area where Nebraska is trying hard, I simply say keep trying hard to improve the appeal of the state to college-educated workers, and especially in our metropolitan areas, and of course also in our rural areas. What steps can we take to appeal to college graduates in particular? That would be helpful for the growth of this key producer services industry. Well, those were the main points I wanted to make with the webinar this afternoon. I certainly appreciate you participating. Feel free to ask a question in the upcoming minute or so. Go ahead and type that into the question and answer window, and I'd be happy to answer your questions. While you're thinking about that, let me just do a little commercial advertising here for our two upcoming webinars. On May 19th, we'll be presenting a webinar on the Omaha Barometer, which is a report the Bureau helps put together for the Greater Omaha Chamber comparing the progress of the Omaha economy with that of a group of other highly successful metropolitan areas, see how Omaha is doing in a relative sense. On June 9th, we'll be presenting our mid-year update of our Nebraska economic forecast. So we do the forecast twice a year, and we'll be showing you our full year forecast for 2017, the outlook for employment growth, income growth, growth in the taxable sales base here in Nebraska and in 2017 as a whole, and then also in 2018 and 2019. So that would be we would hope you would have the time to participate. Both of those presentations are over the noon hour, and you have some information there about how you can go ahead and register right now if you'd like for those two events. So I wanted to thank everyone again for taking the time to participate in our webinar. It was a pleasure for us to present it to you, and I'm not seeing any questions, so I think we'll go ahead and sign off. I will say, feel free to follow the Bureau of Business Research on social media. You see some ways to do that there in terms of LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and so forth. We also produce several, at least 2 reports every month on the Nebraska national or Midwest economy. We can add you to our emailing list to receive links to all those reports as they come out. To join our email list, please send your preferred email to bbr@unl.edu. Let me go ahead and see. We have received a question now. The question is, does the political climate that seems to denigrate the people with producer services income have an impact on the growth of that sector? Well, I think potentially. I mean, I think why do people pursue occupations? Obviously, monetary reward is part of that, but prestige, appreciation are also factors. And I think if an occupation is not honored, not treated with the respect it might deserve, then you're not going to be getting that part of the reward for all the hard work involved in becoming an engineer, in becoming a computer programmer, in becoming an accounting professional, in becoming a business consultant. So I think it can have an effect because, again, the rewards to all the investment required for these occupations is partly monetary and partly personal. Well, not seeing any other questions, let me thank everyone again for participating in our webinar.